We all gathered into a small barn, just outside of the city limits, far away from the lights of the unsuspecting world. Military brass, science analysts, and no small number of experts from various post-darkness disciplines, such as cryptomechanics, neurochimeralists, noctum biologists, and, of course, myself, an occult engineer. The topic under discussion concerned the very fabric of reality itself, and its dawning infirmities. Specifically, how the Great Darkness had conjured a universe more fit for sorcerers than scientists with no head for the wonder of it all, at least. Smoke twirled from a dozen cigarettes, dancing elegantly, silken and gray, eventually blown apart by the ample whispers hissed by men desperate for a handhold in the last world. I, for one, was eager to see them all perish. Yet, despite my preference for seeing the old world crumble, I was summoned into attendance by those who controlled my work, and so there I was, wondering at the expressions and sounds these relics might make when the next world came for them, and come it would. I had no doubts. This was the true reason for my coming. The hushed voices had all converged upon the most imminent and spectacular threat, the raving neo-psychotics. It seemed that their insanity had become infectious, growing leprous and deformative upon the sacred stone tablets of cosmic law. For, as has always been suspected if not formally accepted, the universe is tractable to the mind, but now, after the darkness, it was even more so. Cosmology was now especially fond of doing the bidding of the highly insane, swapping out physics for psychosis, letting lunatics take the wheel, so to speak. As such, it was the expert on psycho-incarnation that began the formal discussion, gathering our attention with a loud shuffling and straightening of his many papers. From all the data we've been able to gather, there seems to be no clear reason why these creatures caught such favor with the universe, except that the more detached they are from traditional notions of reality, the more sway they exercise. The man who spoke seemed to wince beneath the weight of his official burden, to find a way to schematize the chaos of the new world, which was apparently being sprung, at least in part, from the minds of madmen. I decided to interject. Gentlemen, I think it a fool's conclusion to presume these persons are positing alternatives to the universal blueprint, but are instead rewriting it altogether, apparently upon the universe's behest. A better strategy, if you allow me, might be to manage a way to survive by adopting the techniques the universe now seems to be favoring. I shouldn't have spoken thusly, but I was eager to see some semblance of the reactions I mentioned earlier. The response to my suggestion was as predictable as it was swift.
Perhaps we should just strike ourselves in the head with rocks until our brains catch up with the lunatics, huh? It's a ridiculous solution as it is incomprehensible. How would we even implement such an absurd solution? Chided the gray fossil in the general's uniform.
I concealed my smirk and imagined his final moments, sitting in some sterile white office, military medals clenched in his hands, their polished faces pressed tight against his pale, aged breast, all while raging and whining at the world's refusal to rebuke the madness falling out of the sky, unapologetic and paradoxical. I saw that face of his, red and strained, veins showing like fat worms, howling orders no one any longer cared to follow. And then that final realization, like a rock laying heavy in his Dust Bowl guts. I no longer matter. Feeling a bit brazen at the man's dwindling authority, I decided to reply to his rhetorical question, a smirk leaking from the corners of my mouth. That is perhaps one way to do it, and yet there might be another way, less painful to both brain and appearance. I took a long, casual moment to withdraw my notebook from my bag, letting the sarcasm, disrespect, simmer a bit, baiting the many gold and silver festooned corpses into fiery retort. They all feigned ignorance at my spoken jabs, but I wasn't quite done with them. Placing my reading glasses atop my nose and lifting my head in a deliberately ostentatious manner, I pretended to read from my notes, ad-libbing as I went, though infusing my words with no small measure of truth. During the course of my own research, I've dawned upon a number of interesting facts concerning the new reality we've all found ourselves within. Chief among them, that cosmology's responsivity to the impulses of lunatics is no less certain and automatic than it is to the potency of certain dreamers. As you learned gentlemen may or may not know, I've been conducting studies on the effect lucid dreams exert over the material subjects they often are fixed upon. By way of an example, we once arranged for a group of lucid dreamers to focus their collective energies upon the killing of a certain fern, a plant of the waking world that had been sealed behind glass and placed high upon a pedestal within the lab where the subjects were left to sleep and dream. The fern was quite dead upon the conclusion of the experiment, its body brown and desiccated, nearly indistinguishable as a once living thing. I said, pausing momentarily to appreciate my grip over the room. Satisfied, I continued. Now, prior to the darkness, these effects were small, nearly trivial, but for their possible implications concerning the nature of all reality. Naturally, due to the smallness and perceived mysticism of said effects, my allotment for study were appreciably small. But after the darkness, I was given all the funding I could ever need. And I can assure you, fine gentlemen, that the money was very well spent indeed. Now, on to the point. I have in my possession a certain blueprint, a blueprint for a unique machine. You see, certain kinds of people express different kinds of dreams. Just as revolutionaries dream of undoing a system, there are those, perhaps quite similar to yourselves, whose dreams seek its eternal stability. The machine of mine, this potential machine, is capable of cultivating and directing dreams of either type. My point being, with the appropriate subjects, we might be enabled to resist this new order, by way of using its own emergent logics against it. The silence that followed from my little exposition proposal was reward in and of itself, a demonstration of the power I now held over the collection of fools who would try anything to survive the coming changes. The months that followed were filled with an industry fueled from fear. Not since the Second Global War had the world experienced such industry, and all of it overseen by me, personally, which extracted no small amount of resentment from my counterparts. It wasn't that I'd been anointed supreme leader of humanity, but that my work was beyond the ken of my peers, such that my insight was necessary for each and every effort. Naturally, I suffer little by way of limitation. In surprisingly short order, my great shrines to sleep were erected the world over, and with the authority I now possessed, I withheld no expense for the many architectural embellishments I deemed necessary to their appropriate construction. I seized upon the many icons of sleep for the decorating of my temples, Hypnos, Shigorin, Janus. These seemingly useless embellishments I justified as important components to the collective psychology, ideas and themes that would only service the strength of the collective human unconscious, funding the dreams of the few with the strength of the many, or some such nonsense or other. I just believed that a revolution should look a certain way, and what more handsome symbol for change than dreams freshly sprung from immaculate marble? Of course, there were alternative attempts to stabilize reality, albeit much smaller in scope than my own globally sanctioned efforts. Chief among these projects, and perhaps the most elegant, if ultimately hopeless, was the wholesale slaughter of the insane. Anyone showing the slightest signs of mental infirmity were killed outright, their bodies burned on the spot. But the momentum of madness would not be halted by fire. Quite the opposite. As the more extreme the affected solution, the greater and more dire the reaction to the collective human psyche. For every lunatic slain, a dozen more rose to take their place. And, as a not-so-side note, such machinations and madness did more than simply season the flavor of humanity's nightmares. It made them nearly palpable, but most importantly, it made them practically uniform in their content and occurrence. It made them predictable. The time was finally at hand for my machines to do their wonderful work. On the last day, the greatest dreamers I could find were secured within the shrines of my specific construction. Their brains, and subsequently their dreams, joined in a mechanically and chemically induced sleep. Immediately, these persons were inundated with very specific imagery, again, of my own design, and with relative quickness their mental states became identical. This hypnosymmetry, as it's formally referred to in my research, established a sort of mental circuit that allowed their minds to join within a single emergent dream, born between and among them. With the synthetic dream state in place, the next leg of my plan was enacted: the inducement of large populations into sleep, all of them situated around the great shrines, well within the electromagnetic field deployed by the Dreamcaster apparatus. A device that did little more than electrically impart the same kind of imagery as was fed to the enshrined lucid dreamers, although to a lesser degree of strength and uniformity. In essence, I'd created a mental current within sleep, the strongest portions of it composed of the lucid dreams, sweeping all lesser, but similar, dreams into the unfolding mental structure. I was erecting a single, collective vision and filling it with all the minds humanity had to offer. Granted, not everyone was asleep at the very moment of my plan's realization, but the resulting mass dream would be so strong as to take any stragglers into itself the very moment they finally surrendered to sleep. When the vast majority of mankind was unconscious, I entered my own shrine, the greatest of them all. Once inside, I retired to the central dream chamber that was made superordinate to all other shrines. I slid into the contraption and allowed the chemicals that were immediately injected into my arm to close my eyes, trusting my machines to conclude my work. After I had reached the appropriate depth into sleep, my machines would condense the mass dream and all the minds comprising it into a single stream of images, which would then be transferred into my consciousness, becoming the property of my own dreaming mind. When next my eyes opened, it was not upon the prosaic world, if such a term as prosaic has significance anymore. I watched the sea of the sky lap at infinity, heedless of limitations conferred by an indifferent physics. The world stretched out with equivalent endlessness, becoming whatever and however it willed. I strode to the edge of my balcony, beholding the life beginning to stir above and below me, unfurling, questing newborn flesh that was questionably flesh at all, now informed more from imagination than matter. My mind became something new and nameless, no longer defined and exhaustible with prescribed limits. My former life was but a small vantage set out atop the crumbling piles of bygone history and biology. But this new life, this stage upon which all wonder whirled, was a song of being and becoming. The past was no longer dead, and the future merged seamlessly with the present. I was both myself and everything besides. Distinctions and divisions were merely the myths that mirages told their children to keep them from solidifying into the nothingness. But for wonder to truly obtain some stability, if only to collate the contents of an ever-expanding mind, needed to be imparted, and so my mind laid down at the bottom of the expanding vision-verse, becoming its foundation, the principal dream upon which all others would build, and died into the wonder of it all.